70 years ago, the United States overthrew a democratically elected government in West Asia. The victims were the Iranian nation and Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran. Although the coup seemed a success at first, today it serves as a chilling lesson about the dangers of foreign intervention. The 1953 coup reshaped the history of Iran, West Asia, and the world. It restored Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to Iran's peacock throne, allowing him to impose a tyranny that ultimately sparked the Islamic Revolution of 1979. On August 19, 2013, after decades of official lies and denials, the CIA publicly admitted for the first time its involvement in the coup against Iran's elected government of the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The documents made available to the public provided details of the MI6 and CIA operation at the time, which was led by senior U.S. intelligence officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Over the course of 4 days in August 1953, Roosevelt orchestrated not one, but 2 attempts to destabilize the government of Iran, forever changing the relationship between Iran and the U.S. Its aftershocks are still being felt around the world 70 years later. Mohammad Mossadegh was a beloved figure in Iran. During his tenure, he introduced a range of social and economic policies, most significant of all the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. But he made one big mistake. He trusted the Americans. To this day, the overthrow of his government, known in Iran as the 28th Mordad coup d'etat, remains a topic of global interest because so much about it is still under intense debate. For an assessment of the coup's terrible and haunting legacy, please stay with us on this edition of Iran Today. The CIA plot known as Coup 53 was ultimately about oil. Western firms had for decades controlled the region's oil wealth, whether the Arabian American Oil Company in Saudi Arabia or the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Iran. When the U.S. firm in Saudi Arabia bowed to pressure in late 1950 and agreed to share oil revenues evenly with Riyadh, the British concession in Iran came under intense pressure to follow suit. But London adamantly refused. To know more about the 1953 coup, we talked to the Iranian historian Mr. Abbas Salimi Namin, a graduate of computer engineering from the UK and a prolific writer with his main focus on the contemporary history of Iran. He's currently the director of the Iranian History Studies. His big library contains many books from different subjects, including his own translation of The Secret War with Iran.
The British looted our oil for years. They gave us 16% of the oil share and took the rest for themselves. But their looting was even worse than that. Based on documents published after Reza Shah's escape, the British took oil from Iran completely free of charge during the Second World War to fuel their own ships. Admiral Shahin once wrote a letter to Dr. Mossadegh informing him that they had discovered pipes the British had secretly laid from Iran to Iraq without informing the Iranian side. There are lots of such cases.
Subsequently, in 1951, Prime Minister Mossadegh roused Britain's ire when he nationalized the oil industry. Mossadegh argued that Iran should begin profiting from its vast oil reserves, which had been exclusively controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company that later became known as British Petroleum BP. In response, a fuming United Kingdom began conspiring with U.S. intelligence services to overthrow Mossadegh and restore the totalitarian rule of the Pahlavi regime. Though some in the U.S. State Department, according to released documents, privately blamed British intransigence for the tensions and sought to work with Mossadegh.
Right after the nationalization of the oil industry, the coup was considered as an option for both the Americans and the British. They considered it as plan B in case they could not solve the problem peacefully. It was not like that they'd suddenly planned the coup just days before the August 19 coup. Today, with the publication of the memoirs of prominent CIA experts such as Donald Wilber, it has become completely clear that the Americans had this coup in mind and they were working on it much earlier.
However, history shows that eventually CIA and the British embarked on a plot together to undermine Mossadegh's government through bribery, libel, and orchestrated riots. In the process, some 300 people died in firefights in the streets of Tehran, while agents posing as communists provoked and threatened religious leaders, and the U.S. ambassador lied to Mossadegh about alleged attacks on American nationals.
In the beginning, the British made several plans in order to bypass the nationalization of the oil industry without resorting to violence. All these plans, in a sense, set out to take over the Iranian oil industry again, to take the lion's share of the oil revenues again, and to give a few crumbs to the Iranian nation.
Another historian with great knowledge about the Anglo-American coup is Mr. Masoud Rezai, a graduate of political science from Tehran University. We asked him to what extent the coup was an orchestrated, predetermined move.
But after they found out that those apparently legal and friendly plans were not going to get them anywhere, from around January 1951, they seriously considered the coup plan. They formed a headquarters and came to an agreement with the Americans, even on things such as the financial benefits resulting from the coup. They also reached an agreement on the power transition in Iran. According to what Mr. Donald Wilber published in 2000, at the time they were talking about the costs and benefits of the coup. The Americans acted like friends towards the Iranians.
Finally, Britain completed the act by opting for a coup d'etat. The U.S. President Harry Truman rejected the idea, but when Dwight Eisenhower took over the White House, he ordered the CIA to join the British to embark on one of its first covert operations against a foreign government. Therefore, MI6 and the CIA leaned on a young, insecure Pahlavi king and convinced him to issue a decree dismissing Mossadegh as prime minister and back their plot. To do that, they persuaded the Shah's sister Ashraf with a massive inducement to fly from Paris to Tehran to talk the reluctant monarch into supporting the coup.
While the Iranian people were living in absolute poverty, the British were looting Iran's oil. In this context, the Iranian people came to the conclusion that Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and the Pahlavis in general had nothing to do with the Iranian nation. It's worth noting that the Iranian people succeeded in nationalizing their own oil. But Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and his family, including Ashraf, did everything they could do to undermine the Iranian nation's achievement. Therefore, in 1979, even when the Shah admitted his mistakes and even when he promised to respect the rights of the nation, the Iranians didn't believe him. Why? Because this track record had already been tarnished by the 1953 coup, among other things.
Later on, the coup operation began on August 15, but the first attempt was swiftly thwarted by security forces loyal to Mossadegh, and as a result, the king fled the country, while dozens of arrests were made on this occasion. However, the coup, also known as Operation Ajax, eventually succeeded on August 19, 1953, and the Shah quickly returned to take power and perform his duties by signing over 40% of Iran's oil fields to U.S. companies. On the other hand, Mossadegh was tried and kept under house arrest until his death 14 years later.
On August 19, Shaban the Mindless was in prison and was released in the afternoon. Tayyip created this mess. He moved the people from Shush Square and they shouted, "Long live the Shah." But the Tudeh party did not come out to defend Mossadegh because Stalin was dead and the Communist Party of Iran was suffering from internal differences. In such a situation, the Americans had brought $1 million to spend in Iran, but they returned $700,000 back home.
One of the eyewitnesses of the 1953 coup is Mohammad Mehdi Abdkhodai, an old man in his late 80s and the Secretary General of Fadayan Islam, a political party founded in the 1940s. He had a lot to share with us about the coup and the events that ushered it in.
A few tanks came out and staged a coup. The people did not move, they did not react. You can't stage a coup with $300,000. The truth is Dr. Mossadegh was alone. He had lost Ayatollah Kashani and his friends. Mossadegh was left alone, and they overthrew him easily. The coup should not be overstated as the cause of Mossadegh's downfall. He fell, first of all, because of all his own mistakes.
The crushing of Iran's first democratic government, which implemented policies favorable to workers and the poor, ushered in more than 2 decades of dictatorship under the last Pahlavi monarch, who heavily relied on U.S. support and purchased billions of dollars worth of weapons from it. The anti-American backlash that toppled the rule of the U.S. puppet in 1979 shook the whole region and paved the way for Islamic uprising and resistance movements all around the world. Some academic studies and analysis of the economic and political causes of the coup indicate that the primary political motivation of Britain was to repair a battered reputation, boost the national pride, and to hinder the downfall of the empire, while the United States' paramount concern was to feather the Soviet Union's influence on the Persian Gulf region and its strategic resources. But most importantly, their political motivations were heavily influenced based on the economic importance of oil itself as a strategic commodity. In fact, the United States' complicity in the anti-Mossadegh coup was motivated not so much by the fear of communism as fear of the consequences of oil nationalization. This was seen as setting an unacceptable precedent for other third world countries, such as Indonesia and the South American states. With regard to that, Truman has been quoted as saying, "We must prevent Iran from becoming a model for other countries." In London, we talked to Mr. Majid Tafreshi, another Iranian historian who has spent years in studying documents, especially those having to do with the relations between Iran and the United Kingdom. We asked him about documents on the 1953 coup, some of which have been declassified over the past decade.
Since 20 years ago, the U.S. documents have been released. That was mainly the Foreign Office documents on U.S. involvement in Iranian politics. And that was among the series of the State Department's papers that has been released for many years. After that release, which was a rather large volume of documents, and it was published in books and translated to Persian as well, many historians doubted that this is not the files they liked, because the files was not very important documents of State Departments, and the U.S. government denied these documents had been selected for a specific purpose. The historians argued that these documents doesn't show the large scale of the U.S. involvement in Iranian politics and toppling the Dr. Mossadegh government in Août 1953. So they put pressure for more documents.
The 28 Mordad coup was a watershed for Iran, for the West Asia region, and for the standing of the United States and Britain in the world. It ended Iran's drive to assert sovereign control over its own resources and helped put an end to a vibrant chapter in the history of the country's nationalist movements. An immediate consequence of the coup d'etat was the Shah's suppression of all political dissent, especially the nationalist opposition umbrella group National Front, and concentration of political power in the Shah and his courtiers. Democracy disappeared from Iranian society, and independent political parties gave way to state parties. The government formed the secret police called SAVAK, many of whose agents were trained in the United States.
As for the question you just asked, after the 1953 coup, the United States stepped in Iran's internal affairs in a serious way. After they carried out the coup with their own money and management, the Americans forced the British to give them more space in Iran, and the British accepted, though reluctantly, the supremacy of the United States, which meant Washington had the final say in Iran. Then the Americans established a secret police organization known as SAVAK, an organization unrivaled in brutality. With SAVAK, privacy lost its meaning in the country. The Americans created an organization that was unprecedented in terms of inhumanity and crime.
SAVAK monitored dissidents and carried out censorship. It was given a loose leash to torture suspected dissidents with brute force that over the years increased dramatically. CIA staff historian David Robark has stated the CIA carried out a successful regime change operation. It also transformed a turbulent constitutional monarchy into an absolutist kingship and induced a succession of unintended consequences. The 1979 Iranian Revolution was a most impactful unintended consequence. Indeed, these consequences resonated with dramatic impact a few years down the line. When the pro-Western Pahlavi regime finally fell in 1979, memories of the U.S. intervention in 1953 intensified the anti-American character of the revolution in the minds of many Iranians.
Dr. Mossadegh
didn't know that he could not expel Britain with the help of the United States. The US had won the Second World War, and with its Marshall Plan, 85% of British industries that were destroyed by Hitler were rebuilt by the Americans. I say this because when Britain sued Iran at The Hague, Dr. Mossadegh asked the Americans for help. After he returned empty-handed, he said, "It's better to call the US Department of State a British consulate." It was at this point that he realized that the US and Britain were in cahoots with each other.
There's plenty more right after a quick glance at a news excerpt. The Guardian has recently ran this headline: UK should finally acknowledge role in 1953 Iran coup, says David Owen. Former Foreign Secretary says doing so would benefit both reform movement in country and Britain's credibility. The Guardian goes on, the U.S. formally admitted its role 10 years ago with the declassification of a large volume of intelligence documents which made clear that the ousting of the elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh 70 years ago this week was a joint CIA MI6 endeavor. The formal UK government position is to refuse to comment on an intelligence matter. After the 1953 coup, fundamental changes were made in Iran's foreign relations. The government of Iran resumed its diplomatic relations with England and America, but was impacted by its post-coup disposition and had lost its political and economic independence. In light of that, the country was no longer able to control its national oil, and consequently the king agreed to replacing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company with a consortium of British Petroleum and 8 European and American oil companies.
Mr. Abdul Hassan Ibtihaj, a great economic figure in the Pahlavi period, writes in his memoir in 1927, that is before the nationalization of the oil industry, I went to England and I met with Mr. William Fraser, the chairman of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and I told him that we, as your oil partner, need to have access to all financial records. We don't know how much oil exported, we don't know about the real revenues and profits the company has generated, and we should know about them all. Mr. Fraser replies, you will never ever know about them at all. This is the story throughout the period. This is from Darcy Concession, which was a petroleum oil concession signed in 1901 after the victory of the Islamic Revolution in 1979.
Moreover, a pro-American government in Iran extended the United States' geographic and strategic advantage in the West Asia region to the point that it reluctantly forced the country into the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union in favor of the Western Front. 3 main goals framed U.S. foreign policy in the region at the time: the containment of the Soviet Union, the protection of Western access to oil, and the security of Israel. And according to experts, as an underdeveloped economy heavily dependent on exporting raw natural resources from the Western world, the Pahlavi regime had no choice but to become a part of Washington's sphere of influence in the West Asia region. Unfortunately, there are still wide gaps in our assessment of history, including some fundamental questions which may never be satisfactorily answered.
Amazingly, again, the U.S. government announced that most documents of 1953 coup in Iran was destroyed by mistake, and they said there's no more documents. But a few years ago, 8 years ago, again another large volume of document has been published. If you look at these two volume of document has been published, and some CIA leaking documents have been published by Donald Wilber, as well as some by Mark Gazirovsky and his colleagues in the U.S. National Security Archives, which is a private company actually. You can see the most hidden and forgotten element in these documents is the operation of 1953 coup or Ajax operation, and there is no specific or any obvious element of U.S. involvement in Iran. The most line you can find in these documents, the most important line in these documents you can see is the fear of the communism and the Cold War and Soviet involvement in Mossadegh and Iran politics, and they wanted to show that the involvement of U.S. State Department and CIA in Iranian affairs was legitimate, and they were worried about the Iran region and international politics, and they were acting against the expansion of the Soviet empire in Iran and in surrounding areas. So that was the main reason to show that the U.S. involvement in Iran was totally justifiable, and that was right, which we still think these documents are selected and with a specific purpose, not for the purpose of the honesty and honest history writing.
Political partisans on all sides, including the Iranian politicians, regularly invoke the coup to argue whether Iran or foreign powers are primarily responsible for the country's historical trajectory, whether the United States can be trusted to respect Iran's sovereignty, or whether Washington needs to apologize for its prior interference before better relations can occur. But the basic facts are widely known to every school child in Iran. Iranians truly believe that if it weren't for the CIA, the second Pahlavi king would never have been brought to power, and they believe that the CIA continues to this day to operate as an evil force in their country. According to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, also known as the ICCPR, all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and pursue their social, economic, and cultural developments. In light of that, the coup of '53 is a strong example of how the Americans and the British are opposed to the rule of law and the right of a nation to be self-governing. Each year on its anniversary, the coup draws renewed attention in the media. However, the popular interest in the coup itself tends to overshadow the important events that preceded it. In fact, the joint British-American plot to oust Mossadegh was enabled and encouraged by the success of a devastating embargo imposed on Iran for 2 years prior to the coup. On March 15, 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry, and as a result, the country achieved a brilliant victory by cutting British hands off oil wells. But consequently, oil production came to a virtual standstill as Britain imposed a worldwide embargo on the purchase of Iranian oil, and the British technicians left the country. In September 1951, Britain froze Iran's sterling assets and banned export of goods to Iran, in effect preparing the grounds for the eventual coup. The political history of Iran in the last 70 years shows that Iran has always been the target of sanctions, especially oil-related sanctions imposed by other countries. In fact, Iran is the second most sanctioned country in history, and the most widespread sanctions against Iran have been applied after the 1979 revolution, and in particular after the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal in 2018. So the 1951 till 1953 embargo and its implications are particularly relevant today, as Washington and the world contemplate next steps in dealing with Iran's nuclear case and how best to leverage the far-reaching illegal sanctions regime imposed on the Iranian nation. The current sanctions have eroded Iran's oil exports, trade, and integration in the international financial system. For today's policymakers, 1953 and the embargo that preceded it should serve as a cautionary tale. Back then, as now, even a severe economic crisis could not force a simple or quick repudiation of a policy that was perceived by many Iranians as essential to its security and independence. One can easily overstate the parallels between the dynamics of the oil nationalization crisis and the nuclear impasse. Still, for both sides, there are unmistakable lessons to be derived from the embargo and the failed negotiations. The perceiving a conflict in zero-sum terms led to disastrous results for both America and Iran 70 years ago. Hopefully, the outcome of the current stalemate will end in more auspicious fashion. What lessons can be learned from the 1953 coup in Iran?
I think that the important lesson from 1953 coup is unity. Wherever there's disagreement among people, among officials and among personalities, don't doubt that the United States, Britain and their ilk arrive in and try to fuel the disagreement. They try to pit people against each other, then they try to throw country into chaos. And don't doubt that they will do this. This is what was experienced in the past. We should know that we all have a common enemy, and that common enemy neither respects us nor pays attention to our rights. They are after our national resources. They are looking for their own interests.
That's all for today. Thank you for watching from the whole team. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Iran Today. Please tune in same time next week and each week after. And don't forget to leave your comments and topic requests. Till next time, take care.